Hey, this is Dr. Ben Weitz, host of the Rational Wellness Podcast. I talk to the leading health and nutrition experts and researchers in the field to bring you the latest in cutting-edge health information. Subscribe to the Rational Wellness Podcast for weekly updates. And to learn more, check out my website, drweitz.com. Thanks for joining me, and let's jump into the podcast. Hello, Rational Wellness Podcasters. Today, I'm excited to be speaking with Dr. Elroy Vojdani about a new test called the lymphocyte map test. The lymphocyte map test is a new test developed by Dr. Vojdani and his father, Dr. Elroy Vojdani, to determine specific immune system imbalances. Dr. Elroy Vojdani spoke to our functional medicine discussion group in January and informed us about this exciting new test. This is Rational Wellness episode number 244, if you want to go listen to that. And if you want to see the presentation, you can go to my YouTube page, Weitz Chiro. We've known that patients with autoimmune diseases often have immune system imbalances, but it wasn't so easy to find out exactly what these imbalances were. And now we have one test that can help us to really understand this. This lymphocyte map test helps us understand what specific lymphocytes are elevated or depressed, and then we can take specific diet, lifestyle, and nutritional supplements to change them, hopefully in a positive direction. While Dr. Elroy Vojdani gave us a lot of detail of what this test is, since he's a researcher, not a clinician, this is why I wanted to speak with Dr. Elroy Vojdani to help us with some clinical insights for how functional medicine practitioners like myself might utilize this new test offered by Cyrex in clinical practice. Dr. Elroy Vojdani is the founder of Regenera Medical, a boutique functional medicine practice in West Los Angeles, California. Dr. Vojdani began his medical career as an interventional radiologist, diagnosing and treating complex late-stage cancers and other extremely debilitating diseases. But he wanted to prevent these chronic conditions, so he embraced functional medicine and went into private practice. Dr. Vojdani has co-authored over 40 articles in the scientific literature, probably more than that. And he continues to play an integral role in research related to autoimmune, neurodegenerative, and autoinflammatory conditions. And he's just released a new book, When Food Bites Back. Elroy, thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure to be here, Ben.
So, to begin with, for those who perhaps haven't listened to the other podcast, can you explain what the lymphocyte map test is and why you and your dad developed this test?
Yeah, so lymphocyte map testing represents a technological leap in the ability to understand the current state of the immune system. Essentially, what we're doing with this test is tagging and quantifying all the different branches of the adaptive immune system. So we're getting information about B cells, T cells, and more specifically their subtypes, and also natural killer cells. And not only are you seeing quantification, but you're also seeing balance and ratios. And the immune system really thrives on relationships between different populations of cells. And this is really the first time that you get a hands-on, objectively quantifiable look at the immune system. Prior to this, getting a sense of where immune system balance came from was all done by looking at cytokines, so chemical messengers. The problem with chemical messengers is that they go up and down quite a bit over time, and they're not specific to any particular branch. So as we'll get into, there was a lot of discussion in the past about Th1 and Th2, Th17 subtypes of CD4 T cells, which are incredibly important T cells. We never really had a way to say, well, how much Th1 is there? How much Th2 is there? How much Th17 is there? You would only be able to look at the intermediary chemical signals, which were not specific to that branch. So now we get to go to specific direct quantification. And, with that specificity, we have a lot more power.
Okay, great. So when would we use this type of test in a functional medicine practice, considering that, most functional medicine testing is out of pocket and trying to be as judicious as possible with our patients' out-of-pocket costs? Is this a test that we would use for routine screening for patients? Is this a test that we're going to use more specifically with patients who already have existing autoimmune disease? When's the most judicious use of this test?
So I break up that into two big buckets, right? Bucket number one is the autoimmune inflammatory bucket, right? Which is a big part of what comes to us in the functional medicine world. And then let's talk about lymphocyte map testing in another very popular bucket, which is immune dysfunction associated with aging or maybe even mitochondrial dysfunction. Okay. So those are the two main, areas where I find this very useful. I'm not using this as a screening tool. I think this is meant as when you've done the work, you know what's going on with the patient, or you have some suspicion as to what their underlying issues are, you now go to that next step of quantifying specifically where the immune function is so that you know specifically where you can rebalance things. So a very good example for patients that typically come into my practice, they've got these vague symptoms, joint pain, brain fog, insomnia, gut issues, some of the usual things that we find. Sometimes as you're working that patient up, you'll discover that they have a known, or they have a direct autoimmune disease. So, they're planting their flag in the ground. They have lupus, or they have rheumatoid arthritis, or they have ankylosing spondylitis, right? Okay, well, you're making a disease diagnosis there, and that doesn't really stop you from doing the work that you really were intended to do. Now you need to say, well, what am I going to do to make this person feel better? How am I going to balance their immune system? And of course, in functional medicine, we're looking quite a bit at the root, which is incredibly important. To me, the lymphocyte map gives you a different picture. It gives you the picture of today. So it complements that root work and gives you an opportunity or a window to clinically improve them in a shorter time frame while the root is taking its time to do the work.
Okay, so do we know if, let's say we have a patient with some sort of inflammatory or autoimmune condition, do we know if, let's say we see a significant imbalance on a lymphocyte map test, do we know if that is a result of their inflammatory or autoinflammatory condition, or is that one of the causes?
So I think you're asking, is the pro-inflammatory immune subtype the thing that leads to the autoimmune disease, or does the autoimmune disease lead to the pro-inflammatory subtype?
Correct.
Right. The pro-inflammatory subtype typically leads to the autoimmune disease, right? So, you can imagine if, let's say, their Th1, Th17 elevated, they've been that way for 5 or 10 years. I think that's really the really important thing about autoimmunity is it requires that pro-inflammatory subtype for a very long period of time.
Okay. And then do we know if we take some of the interventions that might be effective at modulating the immune imbalance? Let's say we're lowering Th17 and maybe increasing Treg cells, using certain nutritional supplements, diet, exercise. Do we know if that will affect the autoimmune condition?
Yeah, I think this is where the personalization of this immune workup really comes into play, and really where it shines the most, right? Let's say you're working somebody up, you discover that they have an autoimmune disease, or they had an autoimmune disease prior to coming into you. You want to be able to have some discussion about what you can do to help them with their symptom set. And then the first thing that the lymphocyte map or immunophenotyping test is going to do is tell you what areas should you be looking into. And then because you're getting a quantification, you're not just getting a qualitative output, you're seeing on the scale how much of a Th1 problem do I have? How much of a Th17? How much of a Th2? How much of a natural killer cell problem do I have? You can get some sense of like, how much of this is within my grasp, right? And how much of this is not. And I think those are very important distinctions. You can kind of give yourself a window into the 3 or 6 month future for that person and guide them very much as to what they can expect, right? If you have somebody who is beyond the upper limits of detection limit for Th1 and Th17, as much as we think that, we can make dramatic improvements, there's not a lot that diet and supplements are going to do. On the other hand, if they're 20 or 30 or 40% elevated, as long as you use the right targeted nutraceuticals while also working on lifestyle, you can absolutely make that style of change.
And you mentioned Th1 and Th17, for those who aren't aware, those are particular lymphocytes that tend to be associated with pro-inflammatory conditions.
That's correct. So these are all subtypes of CD4 T cells. So let's break up T cells into their two most important branches. We've got CD4 and CD8, suppressor and helper cells. So the CD4s have three big branches: Th1, Th2, Th17. Th1 is responsible for kill of different organisms and as well autoimmune disease. Th2 is the allergic part of the T cells. And then Th17 is responsible for a specific intracellular type of pathogen, a difficult to find or maybe a stealth pathogen.
I've really been enjoying this discussion, but I'd like to take a minute to tell you about a new product that I'm very excited about. I'd like to tell you about a new wearable called the Apollo. And this is a device that can be worn on the wrist or the ankle, and it uses vibrations to stimulate your parasympathetic nervous system. And this device has amazing benefits in terms of getting you out of that stressed out sympathetic nervous system and stimulating the parasympathetic nervous system. It has a number of different functions, especially helping you to relax, to focus, to concentrate, to get into a deeper meditative state, even to help you sleep. And there's even a mode to help you wake up. And this all occurs through the scientific use of subtle vibrations. For those of you who might be interested in getting the Apollo for yourself to help you reset your nervous system, go to apolloneuro.com and use the affiliate code Weitz10. That's my last name, WEITZ 10. And now back to the discussion. Now, a typical functional medicine practitioner, say like myself, I may have a patient come in, say, with rheumatoid arthritis who's being co-managed by a rheumatologist, and let's say they're on methotrexate or they're on some other immune modulating drugs. And I heard your dad say that methotrexate will help to change the lymphocyte map. So, and then I run a lymphocyte map. How do I interpret that in a patient who has autoimmune disease, but who's also taking immune modulating drugs?
All right. So this is, to me, a huge golden opportunity to make an intervention on that patient that they otherwise would never have, and an opportunity to give the rheumatologist data that they didn't know was possible to get. Okay.
Cool.
And both the patient and the rheumatologist will thank you for this. All right. So what you're really looking for somebody who's on methotrexate or hydroxychloroquine or, whatever, first line immune modulator is, how successful has it been, right? Is it creating balance between Th1, Th2, Th17? Or on the flip side, is it maybe overcorrecting and creating imbalance on the other end? What you need to remember is that when we as physicians, rheumatologists, whoever are prescribing this medication, oftentimes it's relatively blind. You've got a diagnosis of the autoimmune disease, you've got the clinical features, maybe you have some basic blood work, but you don't have these specific lymphocyte maps done, right? So you're saying, well, for the majority of people with this clinical condition, methotrexate at this dose works. And if it works at this dose, let's go up a little bit until we, get to wherever, right?
Improvement of symptoms.
Exactly. But you don't know if that means immunological balance, right? Homeostasis. So you can look at the lymphocyte map and say, well, no, we still have quite a bit to go. Or, the methotrexate isn't, really touching this, or we've actually created a bigger imbalance than we started with on the flip side. So,
meaning you're now putting the patient in an immunocompromised situation, in which case, if they happen to come into contact with some virus or some other pathogen, they're particularly vulnerable.
Exactly. Let me take that and run with it a little bit, okay? Because these are specific experiences that I've actually had with patients in interacting with rheumatologists. So Humira is the number one drug in the United States, has been for quite a period of time. For those who don't know what Humira is, it's a biologic. It's essentially a monoclonal antibody against TNF-alpha, a very, very broad pro-inflammatory cytokine, right? And, starting with rheumatoid arthritis or ankylosing spondylitis or, kind of going down the chain, it gets used in more and more and more autoimmune diseases as time goes on, because it's incredibly effective, because it's working on this very, very central pro-inflammatory cytokine. Okay. The theory behind makes a lot of sense, because typically people with these dramatic autoimmune conditions have humongous amounts of Th1, Th2, Th17, and the only way that you're going to get them under control is by using something that blocks the chemical signal, right? But no one is doing follow-ups afterwards to make sure that you haven't bottomed out the immune system in its entirety, right? So if you take somebody with this massive, massive amount of T cells and then they go to 0 T cells, they're going to have a problem down the road, right? The T cells are responsible for viral clearance, as you mentioned. They're also essential for cancer clearance. So,
and if you're trying to develop antibodies to protect you against a virus, it's going to significantly impact the likelihood of that occurring.
Exactly, right? So if you want to know, what is this person really immunosuppressed on Humira, right? The only way to look is to do a lymphocyte map and find out Th1, Th2, Th17. And you have done, again, everyone a service, including the rheumatologist, who is theoretically prescribing the Humira there. And, maybe they can make dose adjustments. Maybe they could figure out another solution. But, clearly it's in no one's interest to be T cell depleted, right? That's not the goal.
Right.
And until this test, you could never look. You had no idea.
Cool. So let's say you had a patient, let's pick an autoimmune condition. Maybe you can tell us about a case, and maybe a case of rheumatoid arthritis or whatever. Pick an autoimmune condition, and then let's say you work them up. Would you run this test at the beginning in a functional medicine approach? Let's say the patient's already diagnosed by a rheumatologist with a particular autoimmune condition, let's say rheumatoid arthritis, and they came in to see me. I would start looking for what might be some of the underlying inflammatory triggers. And based on her history and any other testing she's had done, we'd want to consider, does she have food sensitivities? Does she have some issue with toxins? Are there underlying chronic infections? What's her gut health like? I might run a stool test. I might run panels to look for possibilities for food sensitivities or toxins or infections. Where would the lymphocyte map test fit in? Would this be done as part of the initial screen, or maybe second line, or after we've worked on some of the root causes? Where in the package of investigation would you think it would make the most sense in that type of a scenario? And maybe you can tell us about a case that you've had.
Yeah, I think for probably the majority of cases that come through the doors, it's going to be used as a troubleshooting tool. When you've worked on or looked at the basics, or kind of work through what you expected you needed to work through, and then maybe find yourself up against the wall, and you need some specific information to get you through to the next step. That's probably, to me, the base, like the primary use for using a lymphocyte map, right?
Okay.
I'll give you examples of where I've used lymphocyte map in those situations. Actually, long COVID tends to be one of the areas where I look at this the most.
Oh, great. I'd love to talk about long COVID, because a lot of people realize that there's often, I don't know always, but at least often, an autoimmune component. And then, how do we work that up?
Yeah. Long COVID still, we should say for everybody, is a work in progress, right? And there's probably for the next 5 or 10 years, endless amounts of work that are going to be done to try to really figure out what long COVID is. I think in reality, long COVID is probably many, many, many different things, and each individual is going to have their own version of it. There is an autoimmune version of long COVID, without doubt. I mean, there are papers that have come out, out of Cedars, and then, my dad and I have a paper coming out very shortly, hopefully in a very big journal that we just submitted to, looking at the autoimmune propagation that occurs after COVID, but that's not true for everybody who has long COVID, right? There also
what do you think about some of the other causes besides autoimmune?
I think they could strictly be pro-inflammatory. As we're talking about, TH1, TH2, TH17 imbalances, but very dramatic versions of those imbalances, and very dramatic versions of those imbalances that don't self-resolve as a virus normally would. And, the question, I think, is that because there is a stealth component to some lingering amount of SARS-CoV-2 in the person's body, or is that just because they had a bunch of inflammatory issues prior to their infection, and now their inflammatory cytokine storm or response is just propagating on its own? Those things we don't really know. But to me, there's an autoimmune bucket, and then there's this pro-inflammatory T-cell imbalance bucket. So, the only way you're going to know essentially which one of those you're dealing with is to test, right? In today's world, with so few tools for long COVID, doing something that's very detailed but basic as far as an immune system is concerned, like doing a lymphocyte map, gives you that information hands-on, like, hey, what is happening to this person's T cells? They're 3 months, 6 months out from the infection. They should have rebalanced, but all of a sudden this is up or this is down, and you can put your hands on those imbalances and try to push them in the right direction, and see clinical resolution of the symptoms along the way.
A number of patients have either clotting or vascular or cardiovascular aspects to this. Would that fit into one of those two buckets, or would that be a third bucket?
That fits into the pro-inflammatory side.
Okay.
Right. I think that the clotting, endothelial activation, that's all a pro-inflammatory portion of this, I think.
So would the lymphocyte map be beneficial in those pro-inflammatory conditions?
That's, I think, where you'll find that if you do a bunch of testing before that comes out negative, let's say you're doing an ANA, and you're doing all of these antibody tests to try to find out if there's an autoimmune component, comes back negative, all of a sudden you see a very positive lymphocyte map, you say, oh, aha, that's the problem, right? And let's not forget that there is a very large mitochondrial component with long COVID, right? And the interplay between mitochondria and T cells is very intimate, right? Kind of going back to one of the first things we talked about, what are the two buckets where I use lymphocyte map? The second standard non-COVID bucket where I use it is in the overlap between aging and mitochondrial dysfunction. And that's because the mitochondria themselves communicate directly with T cells. And when there is mitochondrial damage, the T cells will actually transform themselves into a pro-inflammatory state. We don't have, in my opinion, very good testing for the state of the mitochondria. I mean, there are some labs that dabble in this and try to do it, but I mean, in reality, like really reliable mitochondrial status markers are not available. So if you go to the part of the body that communicates directly with the mitochondria, which are T cells, and see the imbalance there, you can make inference that the mitochondria themselves are damaged too.
So how do you identify these patients as potentially having mitochondrial issues? Is it based on the fact that they have unexplained fatigue, or?
Yeah, I have a long clinical screening process with them to try to quantify the extent of the fatigue. I think you also probably have to rule out other common contributors to fatigue, difficulty sleeping, adrenal fatigue, whatever you want to go through. But, essentially, if they have the T cell makeup of somebody with mitochondrial issues, which is, by the way, Th1, Th17 dominant, pro-inflammatory response, and their clinical symptom set matches that, then, that the mitochondrial issues are there.
I'd like to interrupt this fascinating discussion we're having for another few minutes to tell you about another really exciting product that has changed my life and the life of my family, especially as it pertains to getting good quality sleep. It's something called the Chili Pad, CHILIPAD. It can be found at the website chilisleep.com, which is CHILISLEEP.com. And so this product involves a water-cooled mattress pad that goes underneath your sheets and helps you maintain a constant temperature at night. If you've ever gotten woken up because the temperature has changed, typically gets warmer, this product will maintain your body at a very even temperature, and it tends to promote uninterrupted quality deep and REM sleep, which is super important for healing and for overall health. And if you go to chilisleep.com and you use the affiliate code Weitz20, that's my last name, WEITZ 20, you'll get 20% off a Chili Pad. So check it out, and let's get back to this discussion. So tell us about a case of a patient you had with long COVID, and what did you find, and what did you do for them?
So this was a case that came very early on, I think, in when lymphocyte map was first available. So I think we're talking probably around summer of last year. That would be July or August of 2021 for those that are watching the podcast later. Individual had COVID during the big LA wave of winter. We had our own alpha LA variant here. We had a very big winter surge. Lots of people were infected, nothing like Omicron, but definitely a very big winter surge at the time. And vaccines weren't available yet. So that, there were a lot of COVID injuries that happened at the time. And he was experiencing chronic digestive issues. So almost having like a post-infectious IBS picture, but, this time related to a viral infection, very significant fatigue, predominantly morning fatigue. So feeling like they could never really get out of bed, no matter how much they slept, and then brain fog, this kind of cognitive issue that comes from long COVID was still lingering. So this was 6 or 7 months following the infection. The issues were still there. At the time I did my usual workup. My dad and I 6 months earlier had released a paper looking at COVID antibodies having an issue with zonulin. So, did the leaky gut workup, did the blood-brain barrier workup on them? Nothing, right? So everything looked totally normal. Especially with the gut issues, it seemed quite strange to me. Adrenal testing was normal, surprisingly. And then I did a lymphocyte map and some massive elevations of Th1 and Th17 for the patient. And he's in his 30s. So it was very unusual to find that, especially 6 months after the infection. And I gave him, a blend of different antiviral supplements, and then also looked to try to counter some of the Th1 imbalances by pushing the Treg cells themselves. So I went very gut heavy. I did serum bovine immunoglobulins, short chain fatty acids, large amounts of probiotics. I also used spores on him as well too. So that to me was the Treg portion to try to push the Th1, Th2 balance back to where it should be. And then on the antiviral arm of the immune system, he had a low natural killer cell count. So I used andrographis, and then I gave a lot of L-lysine, vitamin C, monolaurin, and olive leaf extract. And we did that for, I think, maybe 2 or 3 months. And by the end of it, he was clinically back to normal. We repeated the lymphocyte map and it was normal afterwards. So, that's an easy case. I think one that was pretty straightforward. There are definitely more complicated versions out there where they require, I think, a lot more calibration on the fly to get them in the right direction. But, typically that's the way they look.
Have you had to use any sort of exotic therapies on patients with long COVID?
Exotic therapies can mean many things in our world, Ben.
I know. There's so many things. I'm always hearing about a new thing,
I think I gave him BPC 157 for the gut portion of
Which
it.
is
I don't remember.
For people who are not familiar.
Yeah, body protective compound 157 is a peptide. I don't remember that it had any healing effect on him, though. I think that's probably something that works way better for people with intestinal permeability or, some actual physical breakdown of their gut lining, which he didn't have, surprisingly, despite all the symptoms. And no, I don't think I used anything else fancy for him.
Okay. Is that something just clinical pearls? Is BPC 157 something you often use for leaky gut patients?
I go through waves. I think when I used it initially, when I first learned about it quite a while ago, I was very impressed with it. And then, you learn other things along the way, and maybe you need to lean a little bit less on it. I think the problem with it is sourcing it and also cost. So, as sourcing got more difficult and costs went up a little bit, I use it in selected cases now where, again, I'm up against the wall and I'm not getting gut healing the way that I want to, but I find it a very helpful compound in those situations.
Maybe you could give us one more clinical case about specifically how you managed a patient with some autoimmune condition and how the lymphocyte map played a role, and then what maybe some specific treatments that you utilized, if you don't mind.
I'm going to give you an example of one in which I had interplay with the rheumatologist.
Okay, that'd be great.
I actually, it wasn't my treatment that really helped this patient at all. It was my relaying of information and utilization of a test that hadn't been done for this patient before. Okay. So I want everybody to kind of understand that sometimes we can be helpful, not by picking the supplement or picking the lifestyle, but by being an advocate for people.
Right.
So this 50-something-year-old woman, she had a very chronic history of joint disease going all the way back to her teenage years. Some people had called it JRA, juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. Some people had called it adult RA. Some people had called it ankylosing spondylitis. All of her antibody tests were negative, so she was seronegative. HLA-B27 negative as well, too. So she didn't fall into any particular bucket, but her clinical symptoms were screaming autoimmune joint disease, but nobody knew what it was. Okay. So she had seen virtually every rheumatologist in town, and everybody was kind of throwing around the idea of a different medication to use just to try it and see if it sticks, essentially. And that didn't sit well with her, and I understand why, because she wanted some specifics. So, I did my workup as far as the usuals, gut health, environmental toxins. She did have intestinal permeability, and she had a very strong antibody response to multiple mold species, and ended up having a large mycotoxin issue. So, I identified those. And at the same time, I ran a lymphocyte map on her because she had been suffering for so long. 30 plus years of having debilitating joint disease is horrible. And so she had extreme elevations of TH1, TH2, and TH17. When I say extreme, they were off the upper limit of detection on all three of them across the board. B cells were normal, natural killer cells were normal. So she's got extreme aggressive T cell activation. I'm looking at that and I'm saying, okay, well, I'm going to work on what I'm going to work on with her. There's always a role to be played for lifestyle. It's always better for her to clear out whatever mycotoxins she was exposed to. It can't be good for her to have those in her body. So I'm going to do that part. But for this person to feel as good as they can, they need a bigger weapon. And I'm not the doc to prescribe Humira. So I got her rheumatologist on the phone, talked to him and said, hey, listen, I ran this test. We did T cell mapping. This is her TH1 count. This is her TH2 count. This is her TH17 count. And the rheumatologist, literally on the phone, said, oh my God, this person has ankylosing spondylitis, right? Humira is the right drug for her. Okay. And, I agreed. I said, as much as I would love for supplements to take this person to clinical resolution, it's not going to happen. They're too far in that direction. So this is the right person for medication. She started on Humira. She called me a week later after she started it. Completely different person, no pain, no fatigue, like all the symptoms went away. And then I said, okay, great. After you're on Humira for 3 months, we're checking your lymphocyte map again, because I want to make sure that you're not going overboard. Repeat lymphocyte map, T cells balanced across the board, not low, not high, just like perfect Th1, Th2 balance. So I said, you rest easy. Your T cells are functional the way that they should. The dose of the medication is correct, and it was the right medication for you. And, to me, that's a huge intervention. And I, didn't do anything other than run the test and then relay the information to the doc who should be prescribing it. And I think it was life-changing for her.
Seems to me another potential benefit of this test is anybody who has autoimmune disease, especially anybody who's getting treated with one of these drugs, who's maybe they feel okay, but they're kind of nervous. If I get COVID, am I going to have potentially have a bad case because of my autoimmune disease, because of my immune status? This lymphocyte map test would be something that would potentially give us some knowledge to help that person, potentially have a more balanced immune system.
For sure. I mean, I think nobody wants to see completely depleted T cells and a dysfunctional adaptive immune system because they're on a biologic. And again, as I mentioned, that's not the intention of the medication. It's the fact that it's being used relatively blindly that people end up in that situation. And that's because tools like this didn't exist before. So they exist, we learn about them, we execute them. Hopefully they start becoming a more regular part of everyone's care. And, everyone's outcome becomes better when we can put the personalized data to their case. So that's what this represents.
Right. And that's what we do in functional medicine, is try to deliver individualized care to the right patient.
That is what we try. We do our best.
We try. Yeah.
We try.
It would be nice if that approach was applied more widely, and instead of just finding one approach to treat patients with a certain diagnosis and applying that to everybody.
Well, but, Ben, we're talking here today. It's my second time on the podcast. I think in the years since my first appearance and now doing this now, your podcast has grown in popularity, which it deserves, definitely. But that's also because people are more interested in this. I think more and more clinicians will become more involved in this as time goes on, because it simply means better outcomes for everyone. It's certainly more time consuming, but it's worth the time consumption because outcomes are better. And in the end, that's what everybody needs.
Right. That's great. Thank you, Elroy. Another great podcast. Can you tell everybody about your practice and about your book, and where's your book available?
Yeah, absolutely. So the practice is Regenera Medical. We're here on Wilshire and Federal in West LA. It's me and a nurse practitioner. The book is called When Food Bites Back. It is meant to be a resource for the public to try to understand first how the environment affects the immune system. And because food is the thing in the environment we are most in contact with, why that's the most important thing to pay attention to when it comes to the immune system. So it's available on Amazon. Just search When Food Bites Back and you'll find it there. I hope everybody likes it.
That's great. Thank you so much. Thank you for making it all the way through this episode of the Rational Wellness Podcast. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please go to Apple Podcasts and give us a 5-star ratings and review. That way more people will be able to find this Rational Wellness Podcast when they're searching for health podcasts. And I wanted to let everybody know that I do now have a few openings for new nutritional consultations for patients at my Santa Monica Weitz Sports Chiropractic and Nutrition Clinic. So if you're interested, please call my office, 310-395-3111, and sign up for one of the few remaining slots for a comprehensive nutritional consultation with Dr. Ben Weitz. Thank you, and see you next week.